Star Trek. Nemesis didn't understand Captain Picard and Jean-Luc's treatment of Troi proves it. Star Trek. Nemesis may have been intended as a grand send-off for the Next Generation crew, but instead, it often felt like a betrayal of the very characters that fans had grown to love. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the film's mishandling of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, a thoughtful, principled, and emotionally complex man who had always tried to lead with integrity. In Nemesis, Picard is barely recognizable, and the way he interacts with Counselor Deanna Troi in particular reveals just how far the character and the writers strayed from what made him great. Deanna Troi is subjected to one of the most disturbing sequences in all of Star Trek during Nemesis, and her commanding officer's reaction is one of cold detachment and narrative indifference. This isn't just an oversight, it's symptomatic of the film's fundamental misunderstanding of Picard's personality, his morality, and the values of the Star Trek universe. What should have been a moment of righteous defense, camaraderie, and emotional support became one of dismissal, minimizing, and objectification. The scene that broke Deanna Troi and Picard too. The clearest example of this disconnect comes in Nemesis's infamous telepathic assault scene. Deanna Troi is psychically violated by Shinzen and his viceroy, essentially weaponized through a non-consensual mental connection. This is framed like a strategic tactic, but the emotional, psychological, and ethical implications are immense. Yet instead of being treated with the seriousness it deserves, the moment is brushed aside with a strategic response that minimizes Troi's experience. Even worse, when Picard later references the assault, it's devoid of the empathy and respect he has so often displayed in past episodes of The Next Generation. There's no conversation, no comfort, no acknowledgement of her trauma beyond how it might be used as a tactical advantage. The Jean-Luc Picard of Star Trek, The Next Generation, would never have treated Troi this way. He was always deeply respectful of her abilities, her insights, and her dignity. He often turned to her for counsel, both emotionally and diplomatically. But in Nemesis, she becomes a plot device, and Picard becomes someone willing to exploit her pain for a win. That's not leadership. That's not Picard. The Counselor-Picard dynamic was always one of mutual respect. Throughout TNG, Picard and Troi had a unique bond, not as close friends like Picard and Data, nor as professional equals like Picard and Riker, but as complementary leaders who offered different strengths. Troi's role was always as the emotional compass of the ship, and even when her empathic abilities failed her, her insight into the human condition never did. Picard valued that. In moments of moral uncertainty or diplomatic crisis, he turned to Troi. He even deferred to her on matters of ethics and psychology, like when dealing with traumatized crew, alien cultures with unusual customs, or first contacts where body language mattered more than phasers. So how did Nemesis get it so wrong? It's because the film seemed more interested in spectacle and grit than in character or nuance. Troi's trauma wasn't used to deepen the bond between characters, it was used to push the plot forward and make Shinzen seem more evil. But using a main character's violation as a mere plot device without offering any resolution, empathy, or character response isn't just poor writing, it's tone deaf. Picard the Protector, Mia. One of Picard's defining traits was his instinct to protect his crew, not just physically, but emotionally and morally. From the time he risked everything to defend Data's autonomy in The Measure of a Man to his personal anguish over losing Tasha Yar, Picard was never indifferent to the suffering of his team. When Troi lost her empathic powers in The Loss, Picard didn't just worry about the mission, he worried about her identity, her confidence, her place on the ship. When Worf faced the consequences of his Klingon heritage, Picard offered unwavering support. When Beverly Crusher questioned Starfleet ethics, he debated her respectfully as a peer and as a friend. That's who Jean-Luc Picard is. So when Nemesis gives us a version of him who practically ignores Troi's assault except to use her abilities against the man who violated her, it feels like a betrayal. Not just to her, but to him. Where was the moment of pause? The quiet word in his ready room? The acknowledgement of what had happened and the offer of support, not just from a commanding officer, but from a man who has long prided himself on being deeply humane? That scene never comes. And in its absence, Nemesis reveals its true colors. It doesn't understand who Captain Picard really is. Troi deserved more, and so did Picard. Deanna Troi was never just the ship's therapist. She was a diplomat, an officer, and a woman of strength who guided the crew through some of their darkest moments. Her ability to empathize wasn't a gimmick, it was a superpower, especially in a universe where so many beings struggled to understand one another. By Nemesis, she had grown immensely, taking on more active roles, becoming a full commander, and asserting herself more confidently. So to have her reduced to a victim with no narrative agency, and to see Picard fail to advocate for her, is more than just disappointing. It's regressive. And here's the real tragedy: by failing Troi, Nemesis also failed Picard. Because Star Trek has always been about compassion, connection, and the strength of character. By turning Picard into someone indifferent to suffering, it cheapened everything he stood for. The real Jean-Luc Picard would have comforted Troi. He would have listened to her. He would have stood beside her and made it clear that what happened to her wasn't acceptable and that she wasn't alone. He would not have weaponized her pain. He would have remembered that every crew member, especially one he had known for decades, deserved dignity. A symptom of a larger problem. The way Nemesis mishandled the Troi-Picard dynamic is just one example of its broader misunderstanding of TNG. The film wanted to be darker, more cinematic, more epic, but in doing so, it abandoned the emotional intelligence and moral depth that defined the series. Data's death is another example. It happens quickly, heroically, but without the emotional resonance the character earned. There's no funeral, no reflection. Just a clumsy attempt at closure through B4, a poor man's Data with none of the soul. But with Picard, the damage runs deeper. Because if you lose his humanity, you lose the heart of the next generation. He wasn't just a commanding officer. He was a mentor, a moral compass, and the embodiment of Starfleet's ideals. That's what Nemesis forgot. And Troi paid the price. The legacy problem. Thankfully, Star Trek, Picard has gone a long way toward reclaiming Jean-Luc's character. The series gave him back his empathy, his introspection, and his willingness to reckon with past failures. When Troi and Riker appear in the series, the warmth is immediate. The mutual respect is obvious. The wounds from Nemesis, both literal and symbolic, begin to heal. But the fact that the show had to fix Picard says everything. Nemesis damaged him, not just through its plot, but by stripping away what made him who he was. And perhaps that's the final indictment. When you misunderstand a character so thoroughly that it takes an entire TV show 2 decades later to remind audiences who he really is, you didn't just miss the mark. You missed the man. Conclusion: a captain out of character. Captain Jean-Luc Picard was always more than the sum of his decisions. He was a leader who inspired loyalty, trust, and admiration not just because of his intellect, but because of his empathy. Star Trek, Nemesis forgot that. And nowhere is that failure more evident than in how he treated Deanna Troi.